Hi, everyone. Good to see you again. I'm Anne-Marie Green.
And I'm Vladimir Dutin. We begin this morning at the White House, where about 12 hours from now, the President of the United States will deliver his first primetime televised speech from the Oval Office. He's expected to once again make a case for a physical wall along the southern border. It is the reason he's refused all attempts from Congress to end the government shutdown, which has now lasted 18 days. 800,000 federal workers are faced with the possibility of missing their first paycheck this week, and soon those on food stamps could miss out on benefits as well.
Meanwhile, Democrats are demanding equal airtime to respond to the president's speech. CBSN will carry their response. In an interview earlier this morning, Major Garrett asked Vice President Mike Pence what the president will say.
Will President Trump declare a national emergency tonight in his address to the nation?
When the president addresses the nation tonight, he'll be laying out the facts to the American people of what is a genuine humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Major, as we sit here today, nearly 60,000 people over the past several months have attempted to come into our country illegally. But for the first time, the predominant number are families and unaccompanied children, and it simply is overwhelming the ability of our Customs and Border Patrol to deal with it. Add to that human trafficking, the flow of narcotics, the apprehension in the last year of 17,000 individuals at our southern border with previous criminal histories, and the American people will hear from the president tonight that we have a crisis and we have to address it, and the time has come for the Democrats to come to the table and start negotiating, not just to end the partial government shutdown, but to address the humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border.
You understand all too well, Mr. Vice President, the idea of this national emergency and going around the appropriations process is something the president has suggested. The country is waiting to find out. Has he made a determination? Is he going to use tonight's bully pulpit to say that?
Well, the president was asked if it was something he was considering, and he said it's something that we're looking at.
That was a few days ago.
But the fact
is the legal review done here at the White House?
The Congress should do its job and come to the table. We spent the entire weekend in this room with senior aides for the Republican and Democrat leadership on Capitol Hill. We listened carefully to what their priorities were. What the president put forward is a reaffirmation of his determination to build a wall on the southern border. But the president said it could be a steel barrier, recognizing the concern of the concrete sun. I think that there were many Democrats in the leadership meetings who expressed concern about concrete, and the president said we'll build a steel barrier. But the president also listened carefully to their priorities about additional humanitarian and medical resources, additional technology for screening at all of our ports of entry. We've incorporated those reforms, including legal reforms. And the proposal that we have on the table is a reflection of the president's priority to build a wall, to provide resources to Customs, Border Patrol, and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. But our proposal also incorporates what we're hearing from the Democrats. But the fact is, what we heard over the course of this weekend is they're not even willing to negotiate until the president reopens the government. And
why won't he do that?
The American people deserve better than that. They deserve the Democrats to come back to the table, start negotiating, and we believe we can resolve this through the legislative process.
Why do you have to put them together? Why can't the rest of the government, unaffected by DHS, Department of Homeland Security funding, be funded and then deal with this issue separately? Why must there be a partial government shutdown affecting all these agencies that have nothing to do with this underlying debate?
Well, really for two reasons. Number one is these are the bills that were remaining at the end of the year.
But you can separate them out. You did that when you were in the House. You know that.
Right. But the fact is, as we've also listened to Democrats, they're calling for changes in our ability to accept applications for asylum at our embassies in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. That would require a change in the State Department's appropriations bill. So what the president is saying is, let's resolve this issue with the crisis on the southern border. If there are other changes in other bills, let's make those changes. But the truth is, Major, you've been around Washington for a while. You know that we could resolve this in a matter of hours if the Democrats will come to the table and start negotiating in good faith. And the American people also deserve to know, on the very first day of this partial government shutdown, the president sent me to Capitol Hill to make a good faith offer that would have avoided the shutdown altogether. Now we're 3 weeks in, and tonight the American people, the president will take his case directly to the American people.
Hey, so Major Garrett is at the White House. Major, while we were listening to the Vice President, Vlad and I were talking just about the various incarnations of this wall. Of course, the fact that Mexico was supposed to pay for the wall, and clearly the president is not negotiating with Mexico about how they plan to pay for the wall. So he's negotiating with Congress about getting payment for the wall, and just the way the language that has evolved over time. And we talked about this, in the 7 o'clock hour. I really expected to hear the Vice President talk about the need for border protection because of terrorism, and he totally did not do that. But what we're hearing over and over again now is this idea of a humanitarian crisis. And the president even asked, I think, for $800 million to deal with the humanitarian crisis.
Right.
What do you make of this sort of evolving approach and where we're at now?
Well, it's trying to address the political situation the White House finds itself in. Just in the midterm elections, where there was this hardcore rhetoric from the administration about the dire threats, criminal, terrorist, and otherwise, the last 3 weeks leading up to the midterm were not about the growing U.S. economy, but about this immigration crisis. It didn't work out for this White House in many, many House races around the country. Democrats picked up 40 seats. That's why they're in the majority. And they essentially were, for a while, replaying that same political playbook. Hard, fearful language about terrorists, crime, et cetera, et cetera. And that hasn't budged Democrats, and it's essentially made Republicans less confident about the end game of this confrontation than they were, say, a week or 2 weeks ago. And so now the White House is trying to shift its rhetoric to talk about the humanitarian needs on the border and all of those who are affected negatively either by human trafficking, drug crossings at the southern border, or those arriving at the southern border who need some kind of assistance as they apply for asylum. But even as the administration shifts its rhetoric, there's an uncomfortable truth it's not recognizing, which is most immigration experts, even those who support the president's pursuit of a barrier on the southern wall, acknowledge that that barrier doesn't address those humanitarian needs. Other things do. The other thing that's worth pointing out in the vice president's answer just a moment ago is that he says, well, look, the president this weekend heard all the Democrats' requests for other funds for other things dealing with the border. Yes, what the administration did was add that on to the wall funding. What the Democrats said was, no, instead of wall funding, spend it on these things that prioritize real immediate needs on the southern border. So when the White House says, look how reasonable we're being, we took all of these ideas from the Democrats. Well, what the Democrats really wanted was to substitute that spending for the desired wall funding of this White House, $5.7 billion. The White House didn't do that at all. Said, nope, $5.7 billion plus all the things you want and no mechanism by which to pay for it, just adding all that to the deficit. Those are reasons why Democrats don't consider this a reasonable or productive negotiating process.
So, Major, let's play a little bit of that conversation that you had with the vice president, specifically about the president's funding request. Take a listen.
We believe $5.7 billion is the proper amount, and we laid out a very specific plan this weekend.
No more funding after that if you get the $5.7 billion for the wall.
The president's proposal is $5.7 billion to build a steel barrier on the southern border.
Down payment or all of it?
We're also requesting, that would be this year's annual request.
Down payment.
But beyond that, we're requesting significant increases, as Democrats have asked for, in a variety of other areas of law enforcement, of detection technologies, humanitarian and medical assistance. We're at $5.7 billion. The Democrats, 11 Democrats in the United States Senate voted for $1.6 billion, and when we sat down in the Oval Office, after all the cameras left, I asked if Leader Schumer was still at $1.6 billion, and he said, no, we're at $1.3 billion.
Major, it is absolutely fascinating to sit there and watch the vice president twist and turn and use all sorts of language,
right.
Having been a former member of Congress himself, as you pointed out during the interview, to try and make a case for the president's political campaign promises that he made on the campaign trail. And it's just interesting to me because a lot of legal analysts say theoretically the president could use the National Emergencies Act of 1976 to declare an emergency. But the framers very clearly laid the power of the purse with the Congress. And Congress has said if the president tries to usurp that authority, that could present a serious legal challenge.
A serious legal challenge. The courts would have to adjudicate that, make a decision about whether the president was using his powers properly. But it would also create a very big disruption and sense of breach in all future negotiations over spending with the Congress. Because, and I've talked to senior House Republicans about this, who say, look, when Congress allocates funds specifically, in this case for the Pentagon, those specific spending instructions must be legally met. And if they're not, and the president tries to change a definition or use of that specifically appropriated money through Congress, he's going to get crossways with Congress. He's going to create a problem for himself in every future negotiation over spending. And that's one of the larger ramifications of this debate and this partial government shutdown. Yes, there are human issues arising day by day. Soon there'll be missed paychecks. There could be jeopardy placed on future food stamp allocations, rent subsidies from the federal government. There are longer lines at the airports. There are other ramifications at national parks and elsewhere. Those are all real. But in addition, if the president were to use this national emergency declaration, he would essentially be telling the new Democratic majority in the House, I don't respect your constitutionally defined role in allocating funds for all federal government operations. That would create not just a problem immediately, but for the duration of that House Democratic majority in the House, where every spending question in the future is dealt with.
You know,
and the other thing to point out is when the vice president says $5.7 billion is this year's request, it's our annual request, every Democrat who hears that says, aha, that means they're coming back again next year. It's a down payment.
Right.
And that is what I was trying to get very specific with this administration about. Is this all the money you need? Or do you need more? So no negotiation on the $5.7 billion, and we're coming back next year.
Major,
that's going to ring in the ears of many Democrats.
When he would not give you a clear yes or no answer to a very clear question, is this a down payment? I thought this is really part of the problem. When the vice president says we could have this settled in a couple of hours, when the president says, you know, we could have this settled in 20 minutes, you know, what's being settled? This $5.7 billion that was being asked for was initially when we were talking about a concrete barrier. Now we're talking about steel slats. Do they cost the same as a concrete barrier? You know, what is this? What are the numbers for? And like you said, is it an initial down payment? It's like a moving target. No wonder the two sides can't seem to settle on what they need and how much it's going to cost. Let me ask you this. The president's supposed to be heading to the southern border on Thursday. You know, what's the purpose of this trip? What can we expect? What do you know about it thus far?
Well, I know it's going to be near McAllen, Texas. That's generally where it's going to be. I don't know precisely where it's going to be. And there are issues in Texas. There have been. President Obama dealt with them. George W. Bush dealt with them. The National Guard was deployed at times. This president put active duty military in Texas to deal with certain things. The stringing up of concertina wire as a at least temporary barrier along the southern border. All of it will be to either hear more and specifically see the areas itself, the underlying issues of drugs coming across the southern border, human trafficking, and the like. One quick thing that is worth pointing out on drug trafficking, the Drug Enforcement Agency says quite emphatically that most drugs cross in trucks at ports of entry, disguised as something else, and also through tunnels, also through ships or sometimes submarines, also sometimes by air. Only reason I point that out, and this is the Drug Enforcement Agency saying it, not me, none of those means by which to get illegal drugs across the border would be inhibited or even slowed down by a steel slat or concrete barrier.
Major Garrett providing clarity as always. A great interview with the Vice President. Major, thank you very much.
Thank you.